The cornbread cooled on the windowsill while 6 men in white hoods rode past, not knowing they'd already eaten their last supper. In Meridian, Mississippi, 1871, Sarah Graves set her table with the precision of a woman who understood that patience, like arsenic, worked best in small, deliberate doses. The linen was starched, the silverware gleamed, and beneath the floorboards, where her husband's blood had soaked through 3 days earlier, the earth still smelled of copper and rage. This is the story of how one widow turned Southern hospitality into a murder weapon, and why the men who killed her husband kept coming back for more. The August heat made everything slower. Conversations, decisions, death. Sarah stood in her kitchen doorway watching the Klan riders disappear down the clay road, their torches leaving smoke trails against the pine trees like signatures on a death warrant. They'd just left her property after what they called a courtesy visit, a reminder that colored folks and their sympathizers had no place owning land in Lauderdale County. James Graves had disagreed. 3 nights ago, they dragged him from this very porch, and by dawn, he was hanging from the old post oak on the Turner property line. Now those same men wanted to buy her out, said a widow woman couldn't manage a farm alone, offered her $60 for land worth $600, said they'd be back next week for her answer, and wouldn't it be neighborly if she'd host them for dinner? Show there were no hard feelings. Sarah had smiled and said she'd be honored. Before we go deeper, I need to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if stories like this one pull you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over 150 years. The Graves farm sat on 80 acres of good cotton land east of Meridian, where Sowashi Creek carved through red clay hills. James had inherited it from his father, a free black man who'd purchased his freedom in 1842 and spent 20 years building something that couldn't be sold away. James married Sarah in 1868. She was a school teacher from Mobile, educated, careful, 18 years younger than her husband. Together, they'd made the farm profitable enough to anger the right people. The Klan in Lauderdale County operated with a casualness that made their violence more terrifying. They didn't hide. Grand Cyclops was William Hatcher, who ran the general store. His second was Thomas Carpenter, the county clerk. Dr. Morton Pierce handled their injuries and kept their secrets. These were men who lynched on Tuesday and attended church on Sunday, who burned crosses and then bought feed at the same store where their victims shopped. James's crime had been testifying in a federal case about voter intimidation. He'd identified 3 Klan members who'd beaten an elderly freedman named Moses Tucker for trying to register. The Reconstruction government in Jackson had promised protection. Instead, they'd sent a letter of condolence to Sarah after her husband's murder. No investigation, no arrests, just sympathy and silence. Sarah had buried James on a Thursday. By Friday, she was grinding something white and fine in her kitchen, measuring it with the same care she'd once used for lesson plans. The substance came from the cotton shed, lead arsenate used for boll weevils. Farmers kept barrels of it. 1 cup could kill a field of pests. 1 tablespoon could kill a man if you knew how to hide the taste. She'd spent Saturday baking, cornbread, biscuits, a peach cobbler, testing her recipes on the farm's hogs first, watching how long it took, noting which doses worked fastest. The hogs died quieter than she'd expected. Sunday, she'd attended church and accepted condolences with the same patient smile she'd wear later while serving poisoned food. What would you have done, standing in that kitchen with your husband's blood still dark on the floorboards? Would you have fled? Sold? Or would you have set the table? Monday afternoon brought the first visit. William Hatcher and Thomas Carpenter, still in their store clothes, riding up casual as salesmen, said they were checking on the widow, but their eyes measured the property like auctioneers. Sarah served them sweet tea and fresh cornbread on the front porch. They ate standing, brushing crumbs from their vests, talking about weather and cotton prices, while James's grave was still fresh dirt 50 yards away. "You think about our offer?" Hatcher asked around a mouthful of cornbread. "I'm thinking," Sarah replied. "It's a big decision for a woman alone." They left, promising to return. She watched them go, counting the minutes until their horses were out of sight. Then she went inside and marked 2 names in the margin of her Bible: Hatcher, Carpenter, the first accounting. By Wednesday, Hatcher was complaining of stomach trouble at his store. By Friday, he was dead. The doctor called it cholera, common enough in August heat. His funeral was Saturday, and at that funeral, like every funeral in Meridian, the ladies' auxiliary served food. Sarah Graves had contributed 3 pans of her cornbread, the recipe everyone praised. Hatcher's widow ate 2 pieces, thanking Sarah for her kindness. Thomas Carpenter buried his friend on Saturday afternoon. By Tuesday, he was vomiting blood. By Thursday, he was gone. Same diagnosis, cholera. Same funeral tradition, same cornbread. The widow's generosity was killing them twice, and not one person suspected the grief-stricken woman bringing food to every service. But Sarah was just beginning, and the Klan had 12 members who'd attended her husband's lynching. 10 more names waited in her Bible, written in the careful script of a schoolteacher who'd learned that some lessons require more than words. The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and formaldehyde, but underneath ran something sharper, the metallic tang of bodies failing from the inside out. Sarah Graves stood among the mourners at Thomas Carpenter's service, her black dress borrowed from the church charity box, her hands folded over a basket of still warm biscuits. She was 29 years old and had become invisible in the way only widows and servants could be in 1871 Mississippi. People looked through her, accepted her food, never questioned why she kept appearing at gravesides. The pattern was forming, but no one was looking for patterns yet. Dr. Morton Pierce gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite the exhaustion creasing his face. He'd been up 3 nights straight with Carpenter, watching the same symptoms he'd seen in Hatcher: violent cramping, uncontrollable thirst, a distinctive garlic odor on the breath. Pierce was educated, trained in Philadelphia before the war, but cholera fit the season, and arsenic poisoning required someone to look for it. No one was looking. From the Meridian Clarion, August 19, 1871. Second prominent citizen succumbs to summer fever. Dr. Pierce urges vigilance regarding water sources and communal wells. Ladies of the Methodist Church providing meals for bereaved families. Sarah had counted on several things. The heat, which made sudden illness expected. The recent cholera outbreak in Vicksburg, which provided convenient explanation. The social custom that demanded women bring food to funerals, making her presence not just acceptable, but required. And most critically, she'd counted on the fundamental arrogance of men who'd never considered that a colored woman schoolteacher might understand chemistry better than they understood their own mortality. Lead arsenate worked slowly, depending on dosage. Small amounts accumulated over days, letting symptoms build gradually enough to seem natural. Sarah had learned this not from books, but from watching cotton farmers discuss pest control, from listening to Dr. Pierce talk about toxicology during house calls to James, from paying attention in ways that seemed like simple, feminine curiosity. She'd turned their casual conversations into her curriculum, their overlooked knowledge into her weapon. The third target was easier than the first two. Samuel Pritchard ran the livery stable and had been the one who'd provided horses for the lynching party. He came to Carpenter's funeral and ate 3 of Sarah's biscuits while joking with other Klan members about how the summer fever was thinning their ranks. Said maybe they should stop drinking from the creek. Someone laughed and suggested the widow Graves's baking was so good, it was to die for. The irony landed with no weight at all. Pritchard started feeling ill on Monday. By Wednesday, he was bedridden. By Friday morning, he was the 3rd burial in 12 days. Some revenge tastes like cornbread. At Pritchard's service, Sarah noticed the first crack in the community's oblivion. 2 women from the church whispered behind their fans, counting funerals on their fingers. But their concern focused on the wrong question, wondering if the water supply was contaminated, if they should boil drinking water, whether their own families were at risk. No one wondered about the food. Southern ladies had been bringing funeral meals for generations. It was tradition, comfort, the social glue that held communities together through grief. Sarah had weaponized tradition itself. She varied her delivery methods now, learning from each death. Hatcher had received a heavy dose, too obvious in hindsight, though the summer heat had masked it. Carpenter got a lighter poison spread over several days through tea she'd brought to his store. Pritchard received moderate exposure through the funeral biscuits, enough to kill, but slowly. She was refining her technique, becoming more efficient, more careful. The Klan held an emergency meeting at the Masonic Lodge on August 24th. 9 members remained from the lynching party. They discussed the peculiar coincidence of 3 deaths, all prominent citizens, all Klan brothers. Some blamed Yankees and federal interference. Others suggested colored folk had poisoned the water supply in revenge for various corrective actions. Dr. Pierce, increasingly troubled, mentioned the possibility of arsenic, but was shouted down. Arsenic required intent, required someone with knowledge and access, required planning. This was clearly disease. Tragic, yes, but natural. William Cartwright, the county sheriff and 4th on Sarah's list, proposed posting guards at wells and cisterns. The group agreed. They also agreed to make an example of any colored person found near white water sources after dark. And they agreed, finally, to accelerate Sarah Graves's departure. The widow had been given 3 weeks to sell. That grace period was ending. Time to make the offer less friendly. What they couldn't see was that the water they needed to guard wasn't in wells or cisterns. It was in the coffee Sarah served when they visited her farm, in the preserves she'd given to their wives, in the communal dishes at church suppers where she'd volunteered to help serve. The poison was already inside their homes. Sheriff Cartwright rode out to the Graves farm on August 27th with 2 deputies. They found Sarah in her garden, cutting okra in the late afternoon heat. She offered them water, pumped fresh from her well, she assured them, perfectly safe. They drank it standing in her yard, discussing her husband's property as if James had never existed, as if the land had simply become available through convenient circumstance. "Week's up," Cartwright said. "We need your answer." Sarah set down her basket. "I've decided to stay. My husband wanted this land to stay in our family." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand your situation. A woman alone, especially a colored woman, can't work land like this. It ain't safe. Things happen." "Things have already happened," Sarah replied quietly. "I buried my husband 2 weeks ago. And we're real sorry about that. But accidents occur. especially when folks don't have proper protection. Now we're offering you good money. $60 for $600 worth of land isn't good money, Sheriff. It's theft. The deputies shifted, hands moving toward their belts. Cartwright raised a hand. That's strong talk from someone in your position. Tell you what, you think on it a few more days. We'll come back Friday for supper, discuss this civilized-like. You're a good cook, I hear. We can talk terms over a proper meal. Sarah allowed the smallest smile. Friday supper sounds fine. I'll make something special. They rode away satisfied, not noticing that the water they'd drunk had a faint cloudiness, not seeing the careful measurement in how Sarah had poured each glass, not knowing that Friday would be the last meal any of them would eat. Back in town, Dr. Pierce was beginning to ask dangerous questions, comparing symptoms, reviewing his notes. 3 healthy men dead in 2 weeks defied statistics. The garlic odor, the extreme thirst, the way their skin took on a grayish pallor. He'd seen this before in medical texts and case studies from Philadelphia. But to voice his suspicions meant accusing someone of murder, and murder required motive, means, opportunity. He couldn't imagine who might want to kill Hatcher, Carpenter, and Pritchard. Couldn't see the thread connecting them because he himself had tied that knot when he'd treated their wounds after they'd beaten colored folks, when he'd signed death certificates calling lynchings accidental, when he'd turned his medical oath into selective service. Pierce was on Sarah's list, too. Number 8. But his death would wait, because sometimes revenge required certain men to understand before they died. Friday was 3 days away, and Sarah had preparations to make. The kitchen table was set for 5 by 6:30 p.m. on Friday, August 30th. Sarah had spent the morning preparing, fried chicken golden and crisp, collard greens simmered with ham hocks, cornbread still warm from the oven, and her specialty, sweet potato pie with a lattice crust that had won praise at every church social she'd attended. The dining room windows caught the last slants of summer light, casting amber shadows across the white tablecloth James had bought from a traveling merchant 2 years ago. Everything looked perfect. Everything was poisoned. Sheriff Cartwright arrived first with his deputies, Elmore and Bass, young men barely 20, eager to prove themselves worthy of the white hoods folded carefully in their saddlebags. Behind them came Robert Finch, who owned the sawmill, and his brother-in-law, Eugene Marsh. 5 men total, 5 seats. Sarah had counted carefully. She greeted them at the door with the deference expected of her, taking their hats, offering wash water for the road dust. They moved through her home with the casual entitlement of men who believed they already owned it, commenting on the furniture, assessing the silver candlesticks, calculating value. Cartwright ran his hand along the mantelpiece like he was petting a horse he intended to buy. "Smells good in here," Deputy Elmore said. "Reminds me of my mama's cooking." "I hope it pleases," Sarah replied. "It's been a long time since I've had guests." They sat where she directed them, Cartwright at the head of the table in the chair where James used to sit. The symbolism wasn't lost on Sarah. These men had killed her husband and now occupied his place without shame or hesitation. She served them with steady hands, filling plates, pouring coffee from the pot that had simmered on the stove for hours, the grounds mixed with precise measurements of white powder that dissolved completely in the dark liquid. The men ate like they did everything else, with aggressive confidence. Conversation flowed around land prices, the upcoming election, complaints about federal troops still stationed in Jackson. They spoke as if Sarah wasn't in the room, or as if she was furniture that happened to have ears but no capacity for understanding. This was their fatal miscalculation, assuming invisibility meant powerlessness. "This chicken is exceptional," Finch said, reaching for a second piece. "You ought to open a restaurant, Mrs. Graves." "Colored woman running a restaurant in Meridian?" Marsh laughed. "That'd last about as long as her husband did." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then Cartwright cleared his throat. "Eugene, that's uncalled for. We're here as gentlemen." "Gentlemen don't lynch unarmed men," Sarah said quietly from her position by the stove. 5 faces turned toward her. The air thickened like storm pressure. Cartwright set down his fork with deliberate care. "Mrs. Graves, I think you're confused about what happened to your husband. There was an unfortunate incident involving some local boys who got overexcited. Nobody intended. You pulled him off our porch at 11:15 p.m. on August 8th. You dragged him 3/4 of a mile to the Turner property line. You hanged him from the post oak with rope from Pritchard's stable. You left him there until sunrise. Then you went home and slept in your beds." Sarah's voice never rose above conversational volume. "I'm not confused about anything, Sheriff." Deputy Bass started to stand, but Cartwright waved him down. "Careful, widow. You're making accusations that could bring you considerable trouble." "More trouble than being widowed at 29? More trouble than having my husband's killers sit at my table demanding I sell them my land for 1/10 of its worth?" Sarah moved to pour more coffee. "I don't think there's much more trouble available to me, Sheriff." She refilled their cups. Every man drank. The arsenic in the coffee was a higher dose than she'd used before. She wanted them to feel it before they left her property. Wanted them to understand, in their final hours, where death had originated. The meal continued in uneasy silence broken only by the scrape of forks and the settling of the house in evening heat. Sarah served pie. They ate it. She cleared plates. They pushed back from the table, Cartwright ready to restart negotiations now that the display of defiance had passed. "About the property," he began. "I'm not selling." Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, framed by lamplight. "Not for $60, not for $600. This land was my husband's legacy, and it remains mine. You can ride back to town and tell whoever sent you that the answer is no." Finch laughed, a harsh bark. "You think you got a choice? Woman alone on 80 acres? Things happen to properties like this. Fires, accidents. Sometimes widows just disappear, and nobody asks too many questions." "Is that what happened to the Turner's barn last month?" Sarah asked. "An accident?" "That was justice," Marsh said. "Old man Turner was hiring colored field hands, paying them wages. That's not how things work here. Death waits in unexpected places." "How things work is changing," Sarah replied. "Federal law says I own this land. Federal troops enforce that law. You might control the county, Sheriff, but you don't control everything." Cartwright stood, his face reddening. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Graves. A serious mistake. We came here offering you a peaceful solution, but if you're determined to be difficult, then we'll resolve this another way. You got 3 days to reconsider. After that, well, we won't be so polite." They filed out, taking their hats, mounting their horses in her yard. Sarah watched from the porch as they rode away in the blue dusk, fireflies beginning to pulse in the grass. She counted their silhouettes until the pine trees swallowed them. Then she went inside and marked 5 more names in her Bible. The poison would take longer this time. Higher doses meant faster action, but also more obvious symptoms. She calculated they'd start feeling ill within hours. Stomach cramping, burning thirst, the characteristic garlic breath. By midnight, they'd be in serious distress. By dawn, at least 2 would be dead. The others would linger into Saturday, maybe Sunday. She'd varied the doses slightly, experimenting with timing. Sheriff Cartwright had received the heaviest measure. She wanted him to go first. What Sarah didn't know was that Dr. Pierce was already at the sheriff's office, waiting with a telegram from the state medical examiner. The exhumation of Thomas Carpenter had revealed something the doctor's suspicions had finally forced him to pursue. The results had arrived that afternoon, while Sarah was preparing her lethal supper. The telegram contained 3 words that would change everything. Arsenic confirmed. Investigate immediately. Pierce had shown the telegram to Cartwright an hour before the sheriff rode out to the Graves farm. They'd discussed it, dismissed it as impossible, decided it must be contaminated well water or sabotage by colored agitators. They'd agreed to investigate starting Monday. Then Cartwright had gathered his men and headed to the widow's for supper, because business was business and hunger was hunger. And what were the odds that a barely educated colored woman could be behind something so sophisticated? Now Cartwright and his deputies were riding back toward town, the poison already beginning its work in their bellies, while Dr. Pierce sat in his office reviewing every death over the past 3 weeks, finally seeing the pattern he'd been trained to recognize, finally asking the right questions. And in her farmhouse, Sarah Graves washed dishes in water heated on the stove, humming one of the hymns James used to sing while plowing. The plates clinked softly. The night sounds of August surrounded her. Crickets, frogs, the distant call of a whippoorwill. Somewhere in the darkness, 5 men were beginning to feel the first cramps, the first hint that something was wrong. By morning, Meridian would wake to news that would shatter its assumptions about who held power and who could wield it. But Sarah wouldn't be there to see it. She had other plans. Because revenge, like any good recipe, required perfect timing. Sheriff Cartwright made it 6 miles before the pain doubled him over on his horse. The animal, sensing its rider's distress, slowed to a nervous walk while Cartwright clung to the saddle horn, his gut twisting like someone had replaced his insides with hot barbed wire. Behind him, Deputy Bass vomited into the roadside weeds. Finch had already turned back, claiming he needed to relieve himself, but his complexion had gone the color of spoiled milk. The garlic smell hit Cartwright's nostrils from his own breath. Thick, chemical, wrong. He'd smelled it before, weeks ago, sitting vigil with Hatcher in those final hours. The memory crystallized with terrible clarity. Dr. Pierce received word at 8:47 p.m. A rider from the Cartwright household, the sheriff's wife frantic, her husband collapsed in the front yard, unable to stand. Pierce grabbed his medical bag, already knowing what he'd find. He'd spent the afternoon reviewing toxicology texts, comparing symptoms, building a case he'd hoped was paranoia. Now his paranoia had a body count, and the count was still rising. He found Cartwright on the bedroom floor, convulsing. The sheriff's wife hovered uselessly, praying aloud, while Pierce conducted his examination with the grim efficiency of a man confirming a death sentence. Extreme thirst, garlic odor, muscular spasms, the distinctive cherry-red coloring of the lips and nail beds. Every symptom matched arsenical poisoning. Pierce had seen enough. "Where did he eat tonight?" Pierce asked. "Just came from the Graves widow's place," Mrs. Cartwright sobbed. "Had supper there, with the boys. Came home complaining of stomach trouble and just collapsed." The widow, the invisible woman at every funeral, the baker of cornbread and biscuits, the quiet presence whose contributions were praised and consumed without question. Pierce's mind raced backward through 3 weeks of deaths, tracking Sarah Graves through them like a thread through cloth. She'd been at Hatcher's service, Carpenter's, Pritchard's. She'd brought food to their homes during their illnesses, offering comfort. She'd volunteered at church suppers where Klan members gathered. She'd been everywhere and nowhere, visible only in her usefulness. Who else ate with him? Pierce demanded. Elmore, Bass, Finch, and Marsh. All the deputies and... She stopped, understanding flooding her face. All of them? Pierce was already moving. Send riders to their houses. I need to know their conditions. And send someone to the Graves farm, now. But Sarah was ahead of him by hours. At 9:15 p.m., while Dr. Pierce was trying to save Sheriff Cartwright's life, Sarah Graves stood in her bedroom packing a single carpetbag. One change of clothes. The $43 she'd saved from selling eggs and preserves. Her Bible with its careful accounting of names. And wrapped in oilcloth, the remaining lead arsenate. Enough for emergencies, enough for one final accounting if the opportunity arose. She moved through the house methodically, erasing evidence of her chemistry lessons. The cotton shed had been cleaned that afternoon. Every trace of white powder removed, the barrel rinsed and refilled with harmless fertilizer. The kitchen showed nothing but ordinary cookware. She'd burned her notes, her measurements, her careful records of doses and effects. Everything that could convict her had been scattered to ash and memory. The sounds of hoofbeats came at 10:05, multiple horses moving fast. Sarah watched from the darkened bedroom as 4 riders surrounded her house, lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies. She recognized Deputy Miller, who hadn't been at the supper. Also Thomas Warner from the mayor's office, and 2 federal soldiers in Union blue. The troops stationed in Meridian to enforce Reconstruction laws that local whites routinely ignored. They pounded on her door. She didn't answer. They shouted her name. She remained silent, watching from the shadows as they debated breaking down the door. The federal soldiers argued against it. They needed warrants, probable cause, civilian authority. Deputy Miller argued for immediate action. While they discussed legalities, Sarah slipped out the back window with her carpetbag, moving through the darkness toward the creek bed. Conscience dies quieter than men. She'd planned this route weeks ago, the same way she'd planned everything else. The creek ran east toward Alabama, its banks thick with cottonwood and willow that provided cover. She knew every twist and bend from years of walking it with James, knew where to cross, without getting stuck in mud, knew which farms had dogs and which didn't. By the time the men broke into her house at 10:32, finding it empty, Sarah was already 2 miles gone. Back in town, the dying continued. Deputy Bass went first, his young body unable to withstand the dose Sarah had calculated for larger men. He convulsed once, violently, and stopped breathing at 11:03. His mother, who'd been tending him, collapsed in grief so absolute it sounded like nothing human. The sound carried through Meridian streets, waking households that had been pretending sleep, announcing that something far worse than cholera was harvesting their men. Finch died at midnight. Marsh lasted until 1:17 a.m. Both deaths were ugly. The arsenic shutting down organs in sequence, the body trying desperately to purge poison that had already saturated tissue. Their families called for Dr. Pierce, who moved between houses like a ghost, confirming what everyone was beginning to understand. They'd been poisoned, deliberately, by someone they'd invited into their homes. Sheriff Cartwright held on longer. His constitution was stronger, and ironically, his habit of drinking heavily had given his liver practice processing toxins. He remained conscious through the worst of it, long enough to dictate a statement to the federal officers who'd gathered at his bedside. From the official record, September 1st, 1871, Sheriff W. Cartwright, in extremis, states that he and 4 others took supper at the Graves property on the evening of August 30th. Meal consisted of fried chicken, greens, cornbread, coffee, and pie. All who ate are now deceased or dying. Suspect colored woman Sarah Graves of deliberate poisoning. Request immediate warrant and pursuit. He died at 2:43 a.m. The last words on his lips, a curse directed at himself for being fool enough to eat from a grieving widow's table. By dawn on Saturday, September 1st, 5 more men were dead. The town woke to news that spread like wildfire through drought grass. The Klan had been poisoned. The widow Graves had done it. She'd fed them death and smiled while doing it. The reaction split along predictable lines. White citizens howling for immediate justice. Colored residents maintaining careful neutrality in public while whispering approval in private. Federal authorities established a command post at the courthouse. Captain William Marsh, no relation to Eugene, took charge of the investigation with the systematic thoroughness the Union Army had learned during 4 years of war. He interviewed witnesses, examined the Graves farmhouse, collected samples of food. The kitchen yielded nothing incriminating, but the cotton shed contained traces of lead arsenate on a barrel rim. Analysis would take days, but circumstantial evidence was already overwhelming. Dr. Pierce provided the medical testimony, explaining arsenic's action, its symptoms, its use in agriculture. He detailed Sarah's presence at every funeral, her contributions to every gathering where Klan members had eaten. He built the case methodically, fighting against his own guilt. He'd been the one who'd taught Sarah about toxicology, who'd discussed poisons during house calls, never imagining his casual lectures were being cataloged and weaponized. How much would it take? Captain Marsh asked. To kill 5 men? In food, diluted, perhaps a tablespoon each, spread across multiple dishes. Less if concentrated in coffee or pie. The beauty of arsenic. Pierce caught himself. The danger of arsenic is its flexibility. Small doses accumulate. Large doses act quickly. Someone with knowledge could calibrate death precisely. And this woman had such knowledge? Pierce hesitated. Sarah Graves was a schoolteacher, educated. Her husband often said she had a sharper mind than most men he knew. If she decided to learn chemistry, she'd learn it thoroughly. The manhunt began at first light. Pauses formed, some official, many not. White men on horseback spreading through Lauderdale County with rifles and rope, looking for a colored woman who'd made fools of them all. The federal troops tried to maintain order, insisting on legal process, but their numbers were too few and local anger too hot. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about restoring the social order Sarah had shattered. What none of them knew was that Sarah wasn't running east toward Alabama. She'd turned north after the first mile, following Sowashi Creek toward the Tennessee border. She moved through darkness like someone born to it. Years of careful observation translating into survival skills. She knew which farms had dogs, which bridges were watched, which roads the patrols would take. And she knew something else. 4 names remained in her Bible. 4 men who'd been at James's lynching but hadn't been at Friday's supper. They'd attend the funerals, though. They'd eat the traditional meal. And Sarah still had poison and patience in equal measure. The hunt was on, but the widow was hunting too. The root cellar smelled of earth and old potatoes, but Sarah barely noticed as she crouched in the darkness. listening to boots thunder across the floorboards above. She'd been inside for 3 hours, hidden beneath the Montgomery farm 6 miles north of Meridian, while search parties tore through the property looking for her. Esther Montgomery, a free black woman who delivered Sarah's stillborn daughter 2 years ago, had shown her the hiding place at dawn and told her not to move, not to breathe loud, not to exist until the searchers gave up. Above, a white voice. "You sure you ain't seen her, Esther? I told you twice already. No colored woman's been through here. You think I'd harbor a poisoner?" This was how survival worked in 1871. Lies told with perfect conviction. Communities protecting their own while appearing to cooperate. Sarah counted 7 different sets of boots crossing above her before the voices faded and horses departed. Even then, she waited another hour before Esther knocked 3 times on the cellar door. "They're gone for now," Esther said, helping Sarah up into the kitchen. "But they'll be back. Captain Marsh is running this methodical, checking every farm, every colored household between here and Alabama. You can't stay." Sarah accepted the water Esther offered, drinking carefully. Her throat was raw from staying silent. "How many dead?" 8 now. Deputy Elmore died this morning. Whole town's lost its mind. They're calling you everything from demon to terrorist. Federal troops are trying to keep order, but the Klan's forming bigger posses. They burned the Williams place last night, said the family was hiding you. Were they? No. That's what makes it worse. They're just burning now, asking questions later. Esther studied Sarah's face. "What you did? Those men deserved it, God knows. But the response is going to fall on all of us. You understand that?" Sarah understood perfectly. This was the calculus of resistance. That fighting back brought consequences not just to the fighter, but to everyone who looked like them. It was the same mathematics that had kept slavery functioning for 2 centuries. The same equation that kept colored folks quiet even after freedom came. Individual revenge triggered collective punishment. "I have 4 more names," Sarah said quietly. Esther's eyes widened. "4 more? Lord Sarah, you trying to start a race war? They started it when they hanged my husband. And you think killing Klan members is going to bring him back? You think federal troops will protect us once you're done?" Esther moved to the window, watching the road. "I loved James too. He was good people. But what you're doing, it's bigger than revenge now. Every colored person in Mississippi is going to pay for your poison." The words hung between them like smoke. Sarah wanted to argue, to explain that silence was its own death, that accepting their oppression was worse than fighting back. But she'd seen the Williams farm burning, knew that innocent people were suffering for her actions. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Some victories cost more than defeat. "Where do I go?" Sarah asked finally. "North, Tennessee, maybe Kentucky. Underground railroads still running. Just different now. Helping folks escape violence instead of slavery." Esther pulled out a scrap of paper with careful directions. "There's a conductor in Enterprise, 15 miles northeast, Reverend John Cross. He can move you further. But you gotta leave now, and you gotta leave the poison behind." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her carpet bag where the oilcloth package lay hidden. The remaining arsenic represented unfinished business, 4 men still breathing who shouldn't be. But Esther was right. Continuing her campaign would bring destruction down on communities that had nothing to do with her husband's murder. "I can't just let them win," Sarah said. "They already won when they killed James. What you did was make them bleed for it. That's more than most get. But now you gotta survive, because survival is its own revenge. Every day you stay free is a day they failed to break you. The logic was sound, but unsatisfying. Sarah had wanted finality, 12 deaths for one, the complete erasure of everyone who'd participated in James's lynching. Instead, she was being asked to accept partial justice and run. It felt like surrender dressed in practical clothing. But the alternative was suicide, and Sarah hadn't killed 8 men just to throw her own life away. She pulled the oilcloth package from her bag, weighing it in her palm. Enough poison to finish what she'd started. Enough to make 4 more widows, orphan more children, add more names to the list of the dead. She looked at Esther, saw the fear and hope mixed in the older woman's eyes, and made her choice. Where can I dispose of this safely? Esther exhaled relief. The creek, downstream from any wells. Dump it and wash your hands thorough. They walked together to Sowashi Creek in the late afternoon light. Sarah unwrapped the arsenic, watching white powder catch sunlight like snow before she poured it into fast-moving water. The creek carried it away, diluting death into harmlessness. She scrubbed her hands raw in the cold water, washing away not just poison, but the possibility of continuing her campaign. You think I'm a coward for stopping? Sarah asked. I think you're smart for staying alive. Esther handed her a rough towel. Cowards don't poison 8 Klan members. Heroes don't have to prove anything to anybody. That night, Sarah began moving through the Underground Railroad's network. Reverend Cross met her at midnight outside Enterprise, a white minister with abolitionist convictions and a covered wagon. He asked no questions, offered no judgments, simply moved her 15 miles north to another station where a Quaker family provided food and rest. The network operated with stunning efficiency. Each conductor knew only the next stop, protecting the chain if any link was captured. Sarah moved through Tennessee like a ghost, passing from farm to church to basement to barn, never staying more than a day, never learning names, never leaving traces. The people who helped her risked everything: legal prosecution, community ostracism, violent reprisal, and asked nothing in return except that she keep moving. But while Sarah traveled north, Meridian continued its reckoning. The funerals for Cartwright and the others became flashpoints. Captain Marsh banned large gatherings, fearing riots. Dr. Pierce performed autopsies on all 8 victims, confirming arsenical poisoning in every case. The evidence was overwhelming, the suspect clear, but the woman herself had vanished. Federal authorities posted a reward, $500 for information leading to Sarah Graves's capture. The amount was substantial, more than most colored families earned in a year. Informants came forward claiming to have seen her in Alabama, Georgia, even Louisiana. Every sighting was investigated. None proved credible. What troubled Captain Marsh most was the response in colored communities. When pressed for information, people provided nothing useful. They'd seen nothing, heard nothing, suspected nothing. Their faces showed perfect blankness, neither approval nor condemnation, just a practiced neutrality that made investigation impossible. He understood what it meant. Sarah Graves had become something more than a poisoner. She'd become a symbol. From Captain Marsh's official report, September 10th, 1871. Suspect remains at large despite extensive search. Local colored population uncooperative, possibly protecting fugitive. Recommend expanded federal presence to prevent further violence. Situation unstable. The situation was worse than unstable. It was infectious. Reports came in from neighboring counties of other mysterious deaths, other prominent citizens falling ill after eating in colored households. Most proved to be natural causes amplified by paranoia, but the fear was real and spreading. White families started dismissing their colored servants, refusing to eat food they hadn't prepared themselves, treating every act of hospitality as potential assassination. The social order Sarah had attacked was crumbling not from her poison, but from the fear of it. And somewhere in the network of safe houses and secret routes, she was learning that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one you use. It's the one people believe you might use. Sarah reached the Kentucky border on September 15th, carried in a false-bottomed wagon beneath a load of corn. The conductor there was a former slave named Marcus Webb, no relation to the doctor, who'd bought his freedom before the war and now used his farm as a way station. "You the poison widow?" he asked when she climbed out. Sarah nodded, too tired to deny it. "Heard what you did. Heard why you did it. Heard they're looking for you from here to Louisiana." Marcus studied her face. "Question is, what you planning to do now?" It was the first time anyone had asked about her future rather than her past. Sarah realized she had no answer. Revenge had consumed her for 3 weeks, giving shape and purpose to her grief. Now that purpose was interrupted, not completed, and she felt hollow. "I don't know," she admitted. "Well, you got 2 choices," Marcus said. "Keep running north till you hit Canada, or stop running and build something new. Either way, you can't go back to being who you were before." Before. The word carried impossible weight. Before James died. Before she became a murderer. Before she learned that justice and revenge tasted exactly the same when mixed with arsenic and patience. That version of Sarah Graves, the school teacher, the wife, the woman who believed in law and right, had died with her husband. What remained was something harder and more dangerous. "I want to stop," Sarah said, "but I don't know how." Marcus smiled without humor. "Nobody ever does. That's the problem with revenge. It doesn't have an ending, just pauses between acts. You stopped yourself this time, but those 4 names you mentioned, they're going to keep breathing, and you're going to keep knowing they breathe. That weight don't ever lift." He was right, and Sarah knew it. The 4 survivors would haunt her not with guilt, but with incompletion. 4 loose threads in a tapestry she'd wanted perfect. But perfection wasn't survival, and survival meant accepting imperfect victories. Canada, then, Sarah decided. New name, new life. Canada's good. But word of advice, whatever name you pick, whatever life you build, don't forget your Sarah Graves underneath. Forgetting who you are is worse than remembering what you did. 2 days later, she crossed into Ohio with forged papers identifying her as Ruth Coleman, a widow heading to family in Toronto. The name felt like costume jewelry, bright but cheap, easily seen through by anyone who looked close. But nobody looked close at colored women traveling north. They were background, scenery, invisible unless they caused trouble. Sarah had caused enough trouble for 1 lifetime. Now she just wanted to disappear. But in Meridian, Mississippi, the trouble was only beginning. Because Dr. Pierce had just made a connection that would turn Sarah's escape into something far more complicated than simple flight. Dr. Morton Pierce stood in his office at 2:17 a.m. on September 21st, surrounded by ledgers he'd been forbidden to review. Outside, Meridian slept fitfully, or pretended to sleep while lying awake with locked doors and loaded shotguns. Inside, Pierce was adding numbers that refused to reconcile with the official story. 8 dead from Sarah Graves's confirmed poisonings. But his ledgers showed 17 deaths in the past 6 months with similar symptoms, all attributed to cholera, summer fever, or natural causes. 17 bodies, 8 explained, 9 unaccounted for. He'd started reviewing records after Captain Marsh had asked him to provide expert testimony should Sarah ever be captured. The task required examining every death Pierce had certified since February, comparing symptoms, looking for patterns. What he found made his hands shake as he transcribed dates and names onto fresh paper. February 14th. Benjamin Sykes, age 42. Symptoms consistent with acute gastroenteritis. Sykes had been vocal about keeping colored children out of white schools. March 9th. Richard Coleman and his son David, both experiencing the same garlic-scented breath Pierce had smelled on Cartwright. They'd burned a colored church in January. April 23rd. Pastor Edmund Hall, a white minister who'd supported Klan activities from his pulpit. May 12th. Judge Harold Thornton, who'd dismissed every case brought by colored plaintiffs. The pattern crystallized like frost on window glass. Every victim had participated in violence against colored citizens. Every death had been attributed to common illness. And every funeral had featured food contributions from colored women in the community. Different women, different churches, but the same methodology Sarah had perfected. What if she hadn't worked alone? The thought arrived with physical nausea. Pierce had assumed Sarah was an anomaly, one grief-maddened woman taking extraordinary revenge. But the dates predated James Graves's death by months. If Sarah was part of something larger, a network, a conspiracy, an organized resistance, then the 8 confirmed murders were just the visible portion of something vast and terrifying. He pulled out a map of Lauderdale County and began marking death locations with red pins. The pattern that emerged made him stand up so fast, his chair toppled backward. The deaths formed a rough circle around colored churches and schools, radiating outward from communities that had suffered the most violence. It wasn't random. It was strategic. Someone had been planning this. Pierce spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing funeral attendance records from churches, both white and colored. He found Sarah Graves's name at 8 services, exactly matching the 8 confirmed poisonings, but he also found other recurring names. Esther Montgomery appeared at 6 funerals, Rebecca Johnson at 5, Martha Collins at 7. Each woman had brought food. Each woman had close ties to colored communities that had suffered Klan violence. The conspiracy wasn't one widow. It was multiple women, possibly dozens, operating independently but toward the same goal. Sarah's mistake hadn't been poisoning Klan members. It had been doing it too quickly, too obviously, creating a pattern that drew attention. The others had been more patient, spreading deaths over months, keeping each incident isolated enough to avoid scrutiny. Until now. Pierce sat with this knowledge as dawn broke, understanding that revealing it would unleash horrors beyond imagination. If White Meridian learned that colored women had been systematically poisoning their oppressors for months, that every funeral meal, every church social, every act of hospitality might be weaponized, the response would be genocidal. Colored communities would be burned wholesale. Women would be hanged on suspicion alone. The fragile peace Captain Marsh was maintaining would shatter into race war. But keeping silent made Pierce complicit in ongoing murders. Because if his theory was correct, the poisonings hadn't stopped with Sarah's flight. They'd simply gone back underground, back to the careful patience that had worked before her explosive 3-week campaign drew attention. What would you do with knowledge that could save lives or start a massacre? Pierce made his decision by 7 a.m. He locked his findings in his office safe, took the map with its red pins, and burned it in the fireplace. Then he wrote a careful report for Captain Marsh, stating that his review of historical deaths showed no pattern consistent with arsenical poisoning beyond the 8 confirmed cases. He called Sarah Graves an isolated incident, a grieving widow driven temporarily insane by loss. He buried the evidence of systematic resistance beneath false conclusions and professional authority. Some lies protect more than truth. But Pierce wasn't finished. He couldn't warn the federal troops without exposing the conspiracy, but he could warn the conspirators themselves. That afternoon, he visited Esther Montgomery's farm on the pretense of checking on a supposed illness. He found her in the kitchen, hands deep in bread dough, the picture of domestic innocence. "Esther," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I've reviewed my records, all of them, and I've made certain connections." Her hands stilled in the dough. "I don't know what you mean, Doctor." "I think you do. I think there are others who do as well." He set his medical bag on the table with deliberate care. "I've reported to Captain Marsh that Sarah Graves acted alone. My records will support that conclusion. But if any more prominent citizens die of mysterious stomach ailments in the near future, someone else will start connecting dots I've chosen to ignore." Esther met his eyes. "You saying we should stop?" "I'm saying that Sarah's campaign worked because it was bold. It terrified people. It changed behavior. Already I see white folks treating colored citizens with more caution, more respect. Fear is a powerful teacher." Pierce leaned forward. "But fear fades, and when it does, the reprisals will be worse than before unless things genuinely change. Legal change, political change. That takes time. Sarah's actions bought you. Don't waste it on more bodies. What about justice for what they did to us? Justice and survival aren't always the same thing. Sometimes you have to choose." Pierce picked up his bag. "I'm choosing survival for all of us. I hope you'll do the same." He left Esther standing in her kitchen, hoping his message would spread through whatever network existed, hoping the poisonings would stop before someone less sympathetic than him noticed the pattern, hoping he'd made the right choice. Back in town, Captain Marsh was dealing with a different crisis. The Klan had reorganized after losing 8 members, and their new Grand Cyclops was pushing for more aggressive action. Not against Sarah specifically, she was gone, but against colored communities in general. Reprisal attacks were escalating. The Williams family's burned farm was just the beginning. On September 25th, night riders attacked the colored school where Sarah had taught, burning it to the ground. No one died, the building was empty, but the message was clear. This was retaliation for Sarah's actions. The federal troops arrested 3 men, but local juries refused to convict. The cycle of violence continued, each side claiming justification for escalation. Yet Pierce noticed something in the weeks that followed. No more mysterious deaths, no more prominent citizens falling ill after eating at church socials. The poisonings had stopped as abruptly as Sarah's campaign had begun. Either his warning had worked, or the network had made its own decision about when to stop. In late October, a letter arrived at Pierce's office. No return address, postmarked from Toronto. Inside was a single pressed flower, magnolia, the kind that grew around southern plantations, and a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for your mathematics. Some equations solve themselves with patience." Pierce burned the letter immediately, but kept the flower pressed in his Bible. It was acknowledgement and promise. Acknowledgement that his warning had been received. Promise that the methods would change, even if the goal remained. The resistance would continue, but differently, subtly, in ways that wouldn't draw the apocalyptic attention that mass poisonings had threatened. By November, Meridian had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Sarah Graves remained at large, assumed to be in Canada or further. The 8 confirmed murders went officially unsolved, but universally attributed to her. White citizens treated colored ones with a mixture of fear and increased respect. Not equality, but a recognition that violence could flow in both directions. Federal troops maintained order while Reconstruction laws slowly, imperfectly, changed the legal landscape. Dr. Pierce continued his practice, treating patients of both races, carrying the weight of knowledge he'd chosen not to share. Sometimes, late at night, he'd think about those 9 other deaths, wondering if he'd been right to bury the evidence, wondering if the women who'd done the poisoning felt guilt or satisfaction, or nothing at all, wondering if justice served cold and mixed with arsenic was still justice. He never spoke of his findings, not to Captain Marsh, not to his wife, not to anyone. Some truths were too dangerous to live outside one mind, but he kept meticulous records locked in his safe, a hidden accounting of what had really happened in Lauderdale County in 1871. Insurance, perhaps, or evidence for a future historian who might understand better than his generation could. The question Pierce never answered, not to himself, not in his private journals, was whether he'd protected the colored women from exposure or protected white society from realizing how close they'd come to systematic elimination. Both, probably. The mathematics of survival required balancing equations no textbook covered. In Toronto, a woman named Ruth Coleman opened a small dress shop on King Street. She was quiet, skilled with needle and thread, known for fair prices and careful work. Customers noticed she always wore gloves, even in summer. They assumed it was a cosmetic choice, a fashion preference. They never noticed the small burn scar on her left hand when the gloves came off in private moments. She never married again, never spoke about Mississippi, built a life so ordinary it became its own disguise. But sometimes, reading newspaper reports about Klan violence in the South, her hands would still in their sewing. Her eyes would go somewhere distant and cold, and she'd remember the taste of revenge mixed with cornbread, the satisfaction of watching powerful men discover their powerlessness. 4 names remained in her Bible, carefully preserved beneath her new identity. She'd promised Esther to stop, and she had. But promises, like poison, had half-lives. They decayed over time, losing potency, creating space for old intentions to resurface. Sarah wasn't done. She was just waiting. 3 years passed before the pattern revealed itself again, and this time it emerged not from Mississippi, but from correspondence between coroners across 5 southern states. The letter that started the unraveling arrived at Dr. Pierce's office in May of 1874, sent by a colleague in Atlanta named Dr. Samuel Brewster. It contained a simple question that made Pierce's blood run cold. Have you noticed an unusual number of former Klan members dying of gastric ailments at commemorative events? Pierce read the letter 3 times before responding. He'd assumed the conspiracy had dissolved after Sarah's flight, that his warning to Esther Montgomery had ended the systematic poisonings. But Brewster's inquiry suggested something far more troubling, that the network hadn't stopped. It had evolved. The Atlanta doctor's research was meticulous. He'd tracked 17 deaths across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina over 30 months. All victims had documented Klan affiliations. All died after attending memorial services, anniversary gatherings, or reunion dinners for Confederate veterans. All exhibited symptoms consistent with arsenical poisoning, though official causes listed natural illness. And at every single event, the food had been prepared or contributed by colored women whose backgrounds, when investigated, showed connections to families who'd suffered Klan violence. The genius of it, Brewster wrote, is that no single woman appears twice. They recruit locals for each operation, women with personal grievances, then vanish back into their communities. By the time symptoms appear, the gatherers have disbanded, the contributors are impossible to trace, and the deaths seem like tragic coincidence. It's not conspiracy, it's franchise. Pierce felt the floor tilt beneath his chair. Sarah Graves hadn't been an isolated incident or even part of a local network. She'd been a prototype, a test case for methodology that had since spread across the South like kudzu. Her 3-week campaign in Meridian had drawn attention, yes, but it had also inspired others. The bold stroke that had forced her to flee had become a blueprint for countless quiet strokes that never drew notice individually but accumulated into staggering numbers. 17 confirmed deaths in Brewster's research, 9 unaccounted deaths in Pierce's own records, 8 from Sarah's campaign, 34 total, and those were just the ones medical professionals had connected. How many more had been attributed to natural causes and never questioned? How many Klan members across the South had died thinking they'd simply fallen ill, never knowing their deaths were as deliberate as the violence they'd inflicted? The mathematics were impossible to calculate. But Pierce tried anyway, pulling census data, mortality records, Klan membership rolls from Reconstruction offices. He worked through the night, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a map of death that stretched from Virginia to Texas. Conservative estimates suggested over 100 suspicious deaths. Aggressive calculations pushed the number toward 300. 300 poisonings. 300 acts of revenge disguised as tragedy. 300 funerals where the food might have contained its own grim justice. Some recipes are written in blood. Pierce should have reported his findings immediately, should have alerted federal authorities, military commanders, civilian law enforcement. But the same calculation that had stopped him in 1871 still applied. Revealing this information would trigger massacres that would make the original Klan violence look restrained. White mobs would burn colored communities wholesale, hanging women on bare suspicion, destroying the fragile progress Reconstruction had achieved. So Pierce made the same choice again. He wrote to Brewster suggesting the pattern was likely coincidental, that arsenic poisoning symptoms could mimic many natural illnesses, that without definitive evidence, raising alarm would cause more harm than good. He burned his own research except for one copy, which he sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened only upon my death, or the death of the last person implicated." Then he did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to Ruth Coleman in Toronto. The letter was carefully worded, nothing explicitly incriminating. He mentioned that he'd been corresponding with colleagues about historical medical patterns, that certain methodologies seemed to have spread beyond their original implementation, that while he understood the motivations behind such methodologies, the scale was becoming untenable, that perhaps the architects of these patterns might consider whether their success had achieved its purpose or merely created new cycles of violence. He signed it, "A friend who once did mathematics," and sent it to the dress shop on King Street, hoping Sarah would understand both the warning and the plea. Sarah received the letter in June. She read it standing in her shop's back room, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a city where she'd built safety through anonymity. The words confirmed what she'd suspected, but chosen not to investigate. That her 3-week campaign had become legend. That her methods had been studied and replicated. That her personal revenge had transformed into something larger than one widow's grief. She should have felt pride. Instead, she felt a hollowness that made her sit down on a trunk of fabric remnants. When she'd poisoned the Whitmore family and the others, she'd known exactly why. For James, for her lost life, for specific wrongs done by specific men. But this network Pierce described operated on industrial scale, poisoning Klan members who might never have personally harmed the women who killed them. It was justice abstracted to the point of becoming its own kind of terror. Had she started this? The systematic elimination of Klan members across state lines? The transformation of funeral food into execution method? The creation of an invisible army that killed with patience and potatoes? Sarah didn't know, but she knew she couldn't stop it. She had no contact with networks in Georgia or Alabama or anywhere else. Her connection to Esther Montgomery had been severed the day she fled Mississippi. She existed now in deliberate isolation, protected by distance and false identity from both pursuit and responsibility. Yet responsibility found her anyway, delivered via Pierce's carefully worded letter. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the dress shop and wrote her own letter. Not to Pierce. That connection was too dangerous. But to an address in Philadelphia she'd heard whispered years ago. A colored newspaper called The Christian Recorder, run by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The paper published accounts of Klan violence, advocacy for civil rights, and occasional coded messages for the Underground Railroad network that had evolved into political organization. Her letter, signed A Southern Widow, detailed the poisoning methodology without claiming personal involvement. She described how easy it was, how effective, how tempting to use kitchen knowledge as weapon. Then she wrote something that surprised even herself. But I have learned that revenge that never ends becomes its own oppression. We poison our enemies and call it justice. But with each death, we also poison the possibility of peace. The Klan must be stopped, through law, through federal enforcement, through political change, not through mass murder disguised as hospitality. We are better than what they made us. We must choose to be better than what their violence tempted us to become. The letter was published in July of 1874 under the headline, A Widow's Warning. It caused immediate controversy. Some readers called it cowardice, arguing that colored Americans had every right to defend themselves by any means necessary. Others recognized the coded message, that systematic poisoning campaigns existed and needed to stop before they triggered catastrophic reprisals. The letter's impact was impossible to measure directly, but Dr. Brewster noted in correspondence with Pierce that autumn that the pattern of suspicious deaths had slowed significantly. Not stopped. Violence still generated violence, and some grievances were too deep for words to heal. But the industrial scale seemed to have paused, as if someone had passed word through invisible networks that the campaign had achieved its purpose, making oppressors afraid, changing behavior through fear, buying time for legal and political solutions to develop. In Meridian, life had continued its uneasy evolution. The Klan still existed, but operated with more caution. Federal troops still enforced Reconstruction laws, though with decreasing support from Washington. Colored citizens could vote, own property, even hold office, though every right was contested, every gain fragile. The 8 unsolved murders from 1871 remained a ghost story that shaped behavior. White folks still hesitated before violence, remembering that consequences could come from unexpected places. Esther Montgomery had died in 1873 of genuine natural causes, taking her secrets to a grave that was visited by an unusual number of colored women from across the county. At her funeral, the food was provided by her family, and no one fell ill. But the women who attended exchanged glances that suggested conversations held in private, decisions made about whether to continue what Sarah and others had started. Dr. Pierce never learned whether his letters had influenced the network's decisions. He continued his practice, treating both races, watching his community slowly, painfully evolve. He saw colored children attending schools without arson, saw colored men voting without being beaten, saw changes that were maddeningly slow but undeniably real. Whether the poisonings had accelerated those changes or merely terrorized opponents into temporary restraint, he couldn't determine. What Pierce did know was that fear could change behavior faster than education or law. The Klan members who'd survived Sarah's era operated differently than those who'd preceded it. They still believed in white supremacy, still wanted colored Americans subjugated, but they hesitated before the most extreme violence. Not from moral growth, but from practical caution. The invisible threat of poisoning had achieved what federal troops and Reconstruction laws struggled to accomplish, making oppression personally risky for oppressors. By 1875, the whispered stories about Sarah Graves had transformed into legend. Some versions had her poisoning 50 men, others 100. Some said she'd been caught and hanged, others that she'd become a ghost, haunting southern kitchens. The truth, that she ran a dress shop in Toronto and had written one letter advocating for peace, was far less dramatic than the myths. But myths had power that truth lacked. The legend of the widow's table kept Klan members nervous at gatherings, made them suspicious of food from colored hands, created psychological space where actual change could slowly root. Sarah had become more effective as a ghost story than she'd ever been as an actual poisoner. In her Toronto shop, Sarah heard echoes of her legend through customers who'd traveled from the South. She listened to exaggerated stories about her campaign, learning that she'd supposedly killed everyone from governors to generals, that she'd had networks spanning continents, that she'd been everything from African witch to northern abolitionist spy. None of it was accurate. All of it served purposes she'd never intended. The woman who'd simply wanted her husband's murderers dead had accidentally authored a methodology that terrified an entire social system. And now, 3 years later, she was trying to close the book she'd never meant to write. But books, once opened, resist closing. And somewhere in Georgia, a young colored woman whose father had been lynched was asking her grandmother about recipes, about which herbs grew near cotton fields, about how much was too much and how little was enough. The cycle wanted to continue. The question was whether anyone could stop it, or whether stopping it would simply allow the original violence to return unchecked. Sarah folded Pierce's letter and placed it in her Bible, next to the 4 names that still remained unmarked. Then she went back to her sewing, stitching hems and seams while trying not to think about the threads she'd pulled that continued unraveling across the South. The telegram arrived at Dr. Pierce's office on November 3, 1876, 5 years after Sarah Graves had vanished into the Ohio River. It came from Toronto, sent by a dress shop owner named Ruth Coleman, and contained only 7 words. One of the 4 is coming home. Pierce read it twice before the implications settled like stones in his stomach. The 4 names. The survivors from James Graves's lynching party, who hadn't attended that fatal Friday supper. Sarah had told Esther Montgomery about them before fleeing. 4 loose threads in her tapestry of revenge. Pierce had assumed distance, and time had frayed those threads into nothing. Apparently, he'd been wrong. The question was which one was returning, and whether Sarah intended to follow. He didn't have to wait long for the answer. The Meridian Clarion ran a notice on November 7th announcing that Colonel Wesley Thorne would be returning to Lauderdale County after 4 years in Texas, where he'd made his fortune in cattle. Thorne planned to purchase the old Whitmore plantation, still sitting abandoned since the murders, and restore it to working order. The newspaper praised him as an example of Southern resilience, a veteran returning to rebuild his homeland. Pierce remembered Thorne from 1871, a Confederate officer who'd transitioned seamlessly into Klan leadership. He'd been one of the men who dragged James Graves from his porch. He'd left Mississippi in '72 when federal attention made the state uncomfortable for known Klan members. Now, with Reconstruction collapsing and federal troops withdrawing, men like Thorne were coming back to reclaim power they'd temporarily abandoned. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, Sarah had learned of Thorne's return. Somehow, after 5 years of silence, she was signaling that her accounting remained unfinished. Pierce burned the telegram and waited for the inevitable. Thorne arrived on November 15th with his Texas-acquired wife, Margaret, a pale woman who looked perpetually startled by Mississippi humidity. They took up residence at the Meridian Hotel while the Whitmore property was cleared and renovated. The colonel moved through town like a man reclaiming territory, greeting old associates, making business arrangements, establishing himself as a pillar of the community. He also announced plans for a grand celebration on December 20th, a Christmas gathering to mark his return and the plantation's restoration. Invitations went to prominent families throughout the county. The event would feature live music, dancing, and a feast prepared by the finest cooks money could hire. Dr. Pierce watched these preparations with growing dread. If Sarah intended to strike, a large gathering provided perfect opportunity. But 5 years had passed. Sarah had built a new life in Canada. Surely she wouldn't risk everything to eliminate one man who'd escaped her initial campaign. Then again, Pierce had underestimated Sarah Graves before. On December 1st, a colored woman arrived in Meridian on the afternoon train. She was elderly, bent with what appeared to be arthritis, wearing the plain dress and headscarf of a domestic servant. She carried papers identifying her as Josephine Turner, a cook seeking employment. Her references, forged but convincing, claimed 20 years' experience preparing meals for wealthy families in Charleston. Colonel Thorne's wife hired her within an hour of interview. Margaret Thorne knew nothing about cooking and less about managing staff. She was desperately relieved to find someone who could organize the Christmas feast without requiring constant supervision. Josephine would have full authority over the kitchen, a staff of 3 assistants, and a generous budget for supplies. The elderly cook started work immediately, testing the kitchen, ordering ingredients, planning menus. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints hurt, but her eyes, when no one was watching, held the cold clarity of someone much younger. Dr. Pierce saw her exactly once, passing on the street near the hotel. Their eyes met for half a second. He recognized nothing in her bent posture or aged face, but she touched her left hand briefly to her right wrist, and he saw, or thought he saw, the edge of a burn scar beneath her glove. Some ghosts return wearing different faces. He should have warned someone, should have alerted Colonel Thorne or Captain Marsh, though the federal troops were mostly gone now. Reconstruction ending in unofficial surrender to Southern resistance. Should have prevented what was coming. Instead, Pierce went home and wrote a letter to be opened only if he died unexpectedly, detailing everything he knew about Sarah Graves and the network she'd inspired. Then he waited, because stopping her would mean exposing her, and exposing her would mean executions for women across the South who'd used her methods. The mathematics remained impossible. Individual justice versus collective safety, personal revenge versus political progress. Pierce had chosen sides 5 years ago. He couldn't switch now without betraying everyone his silence had protected. December 20th arrived clear and cold, unusual for Mississippi but perfect for the celebration. Carriages began arriving at the restored Whitmore plantation at 6 p.m., delivering guests in their finest clothes. Lanterns hung from the old oak trees, including the one where James Graves had died, though no one mentioned that history. Inside, the house glowed with candles and gaslight, transformed from crime scene back into symbol of Southern gentility. Colonel Thorne greeted guests in the parlor where 12 bodies had once lain at dinner. If the irony troubled him, his jovial demeanor showed no sign. He'd grown wealthy in Texas, and wealth had a way of rewriting history. The lynching of a colored farmer 5 years ago barely registered as memory compared to his current success. In the kitchen, Josephine Turner directed her staff with quiet efficiency. The menu was ambitious: roasted duck, ham glazed with honey and cloves, oyster dressing, candied yams, collard greens, fresh rolls, and for dessert, a multi-layered cake decorated with spun sugar. Every dish required precise preparation. Every ingredient had been personally selected by Josephine during her weeks in the kitchen. The assistants noticed nothing unusual except their employer's insistence on handling certain elements herself. The sauce for the duck, the glaze for the ham, the frosting for the cake. She explained it as professional pride, secret recipes she couldn't share. They accepted this without question. Great cooks were territorial about their methods. What they didn't see was the small vial Josephine carried in her apron pocket. What they didn't know was that she'd spent 5 years in Toronto studying chemistry through borrowed textbooks, learning to refine arsenic into forms that were tasteless, odorless, and impossible to detect without laboratory analysis that wouldn't exist in Meridian for another decade. She'd also learned patience. Not the patience she'd practiced in 1871. That had been the patience of accumulated rage. This was different, colder, more calculated. 5 years had transformed her from a grieving widow into something harder. She'd watched from Canada as Reconstruction collapsed, as federal troops withdrew, as men like Thorne returned to power without consequences. She'd realized that her warning letter in the Christian Recorder had been naive. Peace required both sides choosing it, and only one side was choosing. So she'd returned to finish what she'd started. Not as mass campaign, not as inspiring symbol for networks across the South. Just as one woman eliminating one man who'd escaped justice through geography and timing. Dinner was served at 8 p.m. 73 guests sat at tables extending through 3 rooms, the house's walls temporarily removed to create grand entertaining space. Colonel Thorne gave a toast celebrating his return, his beautiful wife, his bright future in the land he loved. Everyone raised their glasses, fine crystal, expensive wine, the trappings of civilization built on brutality. The first course arrived, oyster soup rich with cream and sherry. Guests praised its flavor. The duck followed, skin crispy and glistening. Sides passed on silver platters. Conversation flowed easily, talk of cotton prices and politics, and the general relief that Reconstruction was ending, that proper social order was being restored. Dr. Pierce wasn't present. He'd declined his invitation, claiming illness. But he sat in his office a mile away, watching the clock, wondering if Sarah would actually do it. Wondering if he should have stopped her. Wondering what would happen when 73 bodies started convulsing in the house where 12 had died before. Except that's not what happened. The meal concluded without incident. Guests complimented the food, praised Colonel Thorne's hospitality, departed in their carriages well-fed and content. By 11 p.m. the house was empty except for staff cleaning dishes and Thorne's wife retiring upstairs, exhausted from hostessing. Colonel Thorne remained in the parlor, enjoying a final whiskey and cigar, savoring his successful return. The room was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant clatter of kitchen work. He was alone when the elderly cook entered with a tray containing coffee and a slice of cake. "Thought you might want something sweet before bed, sir," Josephine said. "Special piece I saved back." Thorne looked up, smiling. "That's thoughtful, Josephine. My wife tells me you're a treasure." "I do my best." She set the tray on the side table. "Will there be anything else?" "No, this is perfect." He reached for the coffee, then paused, looking at her more carefully. "Have we met before?" "Something about you seems familiar." Josephine adjusted her headscarf, her bent posture straightening slightly. "I don't believe so, Colonel. Though I've worked for many families over the years. Perhaps at some other gathering." "Perhaps." He sipped the coffee, then cut into the cake. "This is excellent. You've outdone yourself." "Thank you, sir. Though I should mention, that particular piece contains a special ingredient." Her voice had changed, dropping the servile tone. "Something I've been saving for 5 years." Thorne's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at the cake, then at the woman standing before him. Recognition dawned slowly, complicated by her aged appearance, her bent frame. But the eyes were wrong for an elderly woman. Too clear, too cold, too full of specific rage. "You," he whispered. "Me," Sarah said, abandoning the Josephine Turner voice entirely. "Did you really think I'd forget? Did you think distance and time erased what you did?" Thorne stood abruptly, the cake falling from his fork. "You're supposed to be dead, drowned in Ohio." People think many things that aren't true. They thought James was dangerous. They thought colored farmers didn't deserve property. They thought murdering him would have no consequences. She moved closer. They were wrong about all of it. "Guards!" Thorne shouted. But the house was large and the kitchen staff had been dismissed. His wife was asleep upstairs. He was alone with a woman who'd poisoned 8 men and vanished like smoke. "The coffee's already working," Sarah said calmly. "Fast-acting dose, much quicker than what I used before. I learned refinement in Canada. You have maybe 5 minutes." Thorne lunged for the door, but his legs buckled. The poison was efficient, targeting the nervous system before spreading to organs. He collapsed against the chair where James had once sat, where Cartwright had died 5 years earlier. History rhyming with terrible precision. "Why?" he gasped. "Why now?" "Because you came back. Because you thought you could return without consequences. Because 4 names remained in my Bible, and I promised myself I'd mark them all." Sarah knelt beside him, close enough that he could see her real face beneath the cosmetic aging. "You took my husband. I'm taking my piece." "You're insane." "No. I'm justice that your system refused to provide. I'm consequence that your society pretended didn't apply to you. I'm the answer to the question you never asked. What if the people you oppressed stopped accepting oppression. Thorne tried to speak again, but convulsions took him. Sarah watched with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen this death 8 times before. She counted his final breaths, the way she'd once counted her husband's, finding symmetry in the accounting. When it was finished, she stood slowly, adjusting her disguise. She'd learned from previous mistakes. This time, only the guilty party had been poisoned. No collateral deaths, no innocent bystanders. Just one man who'd hanged James Graves receiving the delayed consequence of that action. She walked calmly out through the kitchen, leaving no evidence except a body that would be discovered in the morning. By then, she'd be on the first train to Atlanta, then a ship to New York, then back to Toronto. Josephine Turner would vanish as completely as Sarah Graves had. Only Ruth Coleman would remain, continuing her quiet Canadian life. But before leaving Meridian, she made one final stop. At Dr. Pierce's office, she left an envelope containing a single pressed magnolia flower and a note. 3 remain, but I'm finished counting. Some equations solve themselves with patience. It was both truth and lie. She was finished with personal revenge. But the methodology remained, passed to others, waiting for the next grieving widow or mother or sister who decided that patience and poison were the only justice available. In the morning, Colonel Thorne would be found dead in his parlor. Dr. Pierce would list the cause as heart failure, choosing once again to bury truth beneath convenient fiction. 3 more names from the lynching party still breathed, but Sarah had kept her promise to stop. They would die eventually, everyone did, and she no longer needed to be the instrument. She'd achieved something more valuable than complete revenge. She'd taught her oppressors fear, and fear, properly cultivated, could change the world more than any number of bodies. The widow's table was finally empty, but the recipe remained. The obituary for Colonel Wesley Thorne appeared in the Meridian Clarion on December 22, 1876, listing his cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest. Dr. Pierce signed the certificate without hesitation, his hand steady despite knowing he was documenting his 4th deliberate lie about Sarah Graves's victims. The funeral was held 3 days later, sparsely attended, since Thorne had been back only weeks and his Texas associations hadn't traveled. No one noticed the absence of the elderly cook who'd prepared his final celebration. By the time Mrs. Thorne thought to ask about severance pay, Josephine Turner had dissolved into the air like morning fog. This should have been the end of the story. One widow's revenge finally complete. Her ghost laid to rest along with her final victim. But stories like Sarah's don't end cleanly. They metastasize. In January of 1877, a prominent Klan leader in Montgomery died of mysterious stomach ailments after a political fundraising dinner. The cook who'd prepared the meal had impeccable references from Charleston, the same references that had gotten Josephine Turner hired in Meridian. When investigators followed up, they found the Charleston family had never employed anyone by that name. The references were forgeries, good ones, using techniques that suggested professional knowledge of documentation fraud. February brought similar death in Atlanta. March saw 2 in New Orleans. April added 1 in Richmond. Each victim had documented history of racial violence. Each died after eating at gatherings where the food preparation couldn't be fully traced. Each death was officially attributed to natural causes, because admitting the truth would require acknowledging that colored women had developed systematic methods for eliminating their oppressors. Dr. Pierce tracked these deaths through correspondence with colleagues, watching the patterns spread like disease. But this wasn't Sarah's work. She'd returned to Toronto and her dress shop, confirmed by private investigators Pierce had quietly hired. Someone else had adopted her methodology, improved her techniques, created what amounted to a franchise operation for revenge. The realization kept him awake nights. Sarah had been one woman driven by specific grief to specific actions. This new network operated industrially, killing anyone whose history made them targets, using rotating operatives whose ages and appearances varied, but whose methods remained consistent. They'd learned from Sarah's mistakes. No more rapid campaigns that drew attention, no more patterns that could be tracked. Just individual strikes separated by enough time and distance that each seemed like isolated tragedy. By Pierce's count, 18 men died in 1877 alone, 19 in 78. The numbers climbed while public awareness remained zero. White communities attributed the deaths to coincidence, to the general unhealthiness of Southern living, to God's will. They never suspected their cooks, their maids, their invisible servants of waging calculated war. What haunted Pierce most was the question of complicity. He'd buried evidence in 71 to prevent race war. That decision had allowed the methodology to spread. Now dozens were dead, would be hundreds eventually, and his silence had enabled it. Yet revealing the truth would still trigger the massacres he'd feared. The mathematics remained impossible, except now the scale was larger and the consequences more terrible. In March of 1879, he received an unexpected visitor, a young colored woman named Clara Freeman, traveling from Boston, claiming to be researching conditions for freedmen in Mississippi. She carried credentials from a Negro newspaper and asked intelligent questions about Reconstruction's collapse and the resurgence of white supremacist violence. Over tea in his office, she said something that made Pierce's blood run cold. "I've been studying mortality patterns among former Confederate officers and Klan members. The statistics are remarkable. They're dying at rates far exceeding their white peers of similar age and health. Almost as if someone were systematically eliminating them." Pierce set down his cup carefully. "That's quite an allegation, Miss Freeman." "It's not an allegation. It's an observation." She met his eyes with unsettling directness. "And it's not coming from me. Various medical journals are beginning to notice. Insurance companies are asking questions. Eventually, someone with authority will investigate properly. When that happens, the reprisals will be catastrophic." "What do you want from me?" "The truth about Sarah Graves." Clara leaned forward. "I know she was real, that she killed 8 men here in 71, that she escaped. I know you covered for her. Your death certificates are remarkably consistent about sudden natural deaths among Klan members. What I don't know is whether she's still operating or whether others are using her methods." Pierce considered his options. Deny everything and maintain the silence that had protected dozens of women. Tell the truth and potentially trigger the investigations and reprisals he'd feared for 8 years. Or find some middle path that might actually stop the killing without causing massacres. "Why are you really here?" he asked. Clara's expression softened slightly. "Because I'm Sarah Graves's daughter." The words hung between them like smoke. Pierce searched her face for resemblance and found it in the eyes. That same cold clarity he'd seen in Sarah's expression when she'd left the magnolia flower. But Clara was younger, smoother, educated in ways that Sarah's generation had been denied. "Sarah had no children," Pierce said carefully. "Not that she raised, but she bore me in 63, gave me to a free black family in Mobile who could protect me. I learned about her later, after the poisonings became legend." Clara pulled out a worn Bible, Sarah's Bible with its list of names. She sent this before she died, wanted me to understand what she'd done and why. Died? The word came out sharper than Pierce intended. Last November, pneumonia in Toronto. She spent her final days writing letters, trying to convince the network to stop. They didn't listen. Her methods outlived her, and now they're threatening everything she claimed to want. Safety, justice, peace for our people. Pierce absorbed this information slowly. Sarah was dead. The woman he'd protected and feared and secretly admired for 8 years was gone. But her creation lived on, growing more dangerous with each iteration. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Write the truth, all of it. Document every case you know about, every woman you suspect, every victim you've covered for. Then we publish it, not to white authorities who'll use it to justify violence, but to Negro churches and schools and newspapers. We tell our own people that this campaign has to stop before it destroys us." They won't listen. Some won't, but some will. Enough might. Clara opened the Bible to the list of names. My mother marked 12 men for death. She killed 9. 3 survived. And you know what she told me in her letter? That those 3 surviving was the most important thing she ever did. Because stopping herself proved that we're not defined by our oppressor's violence, that we can choose differently. Pierce thought about 8 years of lies, of covering for poisoners, of mathematics that never balanced. If I write this, if we publish it, I'll lose my medical license, possibly face criminal charges. Yes, but you'll also save lives. Both colored women who'll hang if they're caught, and white men who might not deserve death for their father's crimes. Clara closed the Bible. My mother started something she couldn't stop. Maybe we can finish it differently. Over the next 3 months, Pierce wrote his account. 57 pages documenting every suspicious death, every pattern he'd noticed, every decision he'd made to bury evidence. He named no names, protecting the women even while condemning their methods, but provided enough detail that anyone reading would understand the scope and sophistication of the operation. Clara arranged publication through the AME Church Review in June of 1879, under the title The Widow's Table, a physician's accounting of systematic poisoning in the post-war South. The article caused immediate upheaval. White newspapers largely ignored it, dismissing it as Negro propaganda. But in colored communities, it sparked fierce debate. Some called Pierce a traitor for exposing the methods. Others thanked him for warning against a campaign that would inevitably trigger white backlash. Ministers preached sermons about the moral implications of revenge versus forgiveness. Women's groups split over whether the poisonings were justified resistance or murder that dishonored the victims they claimed to avenge. The poisonings didn't stop entirely. Pierce tracked 6 more deaths that year, but the rate slowed dramatically. Either his article had convinced some participants to stop, or the exposure had made the methods too risky to continue. Either way, by 1880, the pattern had broken. Individual acts of revenge still occurred, but the systematic campaign that Sarah had accidentally inspired seemed finally to have ended. Pierce lost his medical license in 1881, as Clara had predicted. The Mississippi Medical Board couldn't prosecute him for murder. Too much time had passed, too little direct evidence, but they could revoke his credentials for conduct unbecoming the profession. He spent his remaining years working as an unlicensed herbalist, treating colored patients who couldn't afford or weren't welcome with white physicians. Clara Freeman became a prominent voice in the Negro rights movement. arguing that true freedom required rejecting violence even against violent oppressors. She gave speeches about her mother, always referring to Sarah as someone she'd studied rather than being related to, protecting both their identities. She turned the widow's table into a parable about the dangers of letting justified anger become consuming rage. In Toronto, Ruth Coleman's dress shop continued operating until 1893, when it closed upon the owner's death. Local papers ran a brief obituary noting that the quiet seamstress had left her modest estate to a colored orphanage in Boston. No one connected Ruth Coleman to Sarah Graves. No one realized that the elderly woman who'd sewn their clothes had once poisoned 8 men and inspired dozens more deaths across the South. But the story persisted in whispered form, passed through colored communities like contraband knowledge. The widow's table became legend, sometimes warning, sometimes inspiration, always reminder that the powerless had power if they were willing to use it. Details changed with each telling. The number of victims multiplied. Sarah's fate varied from martyrdom to escape to immortality. The truth became irrelevant compared to what the story represented. Even today, some older folks in Meridian will tell you about the widow who fed death to Klan members and vanished into myth. They'll point to the old Whitmore property, now a parking lot for a grocery store, and claim you can still smell magnolia and arsenic on humid August nights. They'll warn that hospitality weaponized is hospitality destroyed, that revenge served cold is still revenge, that some tables set with hatred never truly clear. Dr. Pierce died in 1904, taking his remaining secrets to the grave. But he left behind one final document, a sealed letter that wasn't discovered until 2012, during renovation of the old Meridian courthouse. In it, he admitted something he'd never told anyone. He'd known about Sarah's final poisoning of Colonel Thorne before it happened. Known and said nothing. Chosen one man's death over exposing a woman who'd already sacrificed everything. "I don't know if I made the right choice," Pierce wrote. "I only know I made the human one. Sarah Graves was murderer, terrorist, hero, and victim, all true simultaneously. History will judge her. I only tried to understand her." History hasn't finished judging. The widow's table remains controversial, a Rorschach test for how we think about justice, violence, and the mathematics of oppression. Was Sarah Graves a monster who inspired mass murder? Or was she a desperate woman who found the only weapon her society allowed and used it with devastating precision? The answer probably depends on whether you see yourself at her table or across from it. 3 names from James Graves's lynching party survived, dying eventually of genuinely natural causes decades later, never knowing how close they'd come to Sarah's accounting. Sometimes mercy looks like incompletion. Sometimes survival is its own punishment, living with knowledge that death came for your companions but somehow missed you. They say on certain August nights, when humidity makes the air thick enough to taste, you can still find women in southern kitchens measuring ingredients with unusual care, and that somewhere in those measurements, between the salt and the sugar, lives the ghost of a widow who taught patience, poison, and the terrible price of both. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.